My time so far at the RCC has been great. I've been really excited to join this intellectual community that both the fellows and the students and the staff of the RCC have created, and I feel lucky that this is only the start of my journey here. So thank you. No escape to nature is complete without a trip to the store. Or so believe millions of American outdoor enthusiasts in the 20th and 21st century. This picture that you see is a scene of wild nature, some timeless landscape in a western park in the United States. But it's not just that. As the cover of an outdoor company catalog from the 1970s, it's also a representation of the central role that outdoor companies play in mediating Americans' back-to-nature experiences. By some estimates, outdoor recreation tops consumer spending on pharmaceuticals in the United States at $887 billion last year, so the orange bar that you see here. But I can paint the ubiquitous influence of the outdoor industry in another way. 100 years ago, wearing sports clothes to an office or an academic talk would have been unthinkable, but outdoor clothes revolutionized how Americans and people around the world dress, and now many of you likely own fleeces from companies like Patagonia or the North Face that will never summit a mountain. My book project asks why Americans go shopping on their way to the wilderness. In the late 19th century, American travelers saw their excursions to the mountains as emblems of anti-modern or primitive experience, even as they brought modern equipment from outfitters like Abercrombie Fitch with them from the city. The symbolic significance of nature, defined in opposition to modernity, remained for the next 150 years. Nonetheless, outdoor companies, from L. Bean and Eddie Bauer to Eastern Mountain Sports in Patagonia, have played a central role in shaping American travelers' material experiences and their ideas about the nature they were getting back to. Entrepreneurs, companies, and outdoors people themselves shaped the market of mass-produced goods that led to the ironic outcome that Americans know nature primarily through consumption. So this is not a history of hiking or fishing, though initially I did want it to be that. And few characters in the book are actually out on the trail for very long. Instead, using corporate archives, military records, published magazines, and guidebooks, I page through catalogs, browse inventory on shelves, examine laboratory experiments, and join military expeditions. Together, I use these documents to show how Americans made consuming a central step on their path to mastering the outdoors. And I also show how outdoor style became American style. Both the cultural influence of the outdoor industry and the material goods it produces touches the lives of people who will never set foot on a trail. I'll cover 3 different episodes briefly today on Western hunting jackets in the 1920s, Army uniforms during World War II, and a miracle synthetic material in the 1970s and 1980s. You can follow along in the table of contents. I included that mostly because there are lots of other stories I don't get to cover here, but I'm happy to answer questions about them. Together, these stories are a means to understanding what people say through what they buy. I want to explain what makes the turn towards consumption in the 20th century so remarkable. In late 19th century outdoor literature in the United States, the predominant ethos of the outdoors was called woodcraft. Woodcraft meant mastering nature by buying little and building everything you needed to survive from nature's storehouse. Woodcraft authors promulgated a suspicion of bought things. Rather than buy a metal stove for a camp kitchen, an outdoorsman ought to build one himself by cutting down some trees. Don't trust shopkeepers, these woodcrafters admonish, because they're just trying to convince you to get some gadget that will get in the way of your experience. Around the turn of the century, a new attitude towards consumption arose. Guidebook authors, outdoor companies, and consumers themselves began to see these gadgets in a new light. Nature experience was still about escape, but companies began to suggest that Americans needed to buy equipment and clothing in order to have that full, authentic experience. So in the image that you see here from a fishing catalog, respite and renewal awaits the office worker sitting at his desk in the top part of the image, but only if he knows what fishing tackle to buy. The motto of one of the most famous outdoor outfitters of the turn of the 20th century captures this notion well. Abercrombie Fitch had a 12-story high headquarters in Manhattan on Madison Avenue. It was here, the company claimed, where the Blaze Trail crosses the boulevard. In sharp contrast to that anti-consumerist woodcraft ethos of making what you need, Abercrombie Fitch and similar companies argued that to get to the Blaze Trail, you needed to start at the boulevard. One of the most unusual marketing techniques that outdoor companies used in this period was to sell a nostalgic vision of the American past. This vision relied on the myth of the vanishing American frontier, and it idealized male outdoor workers as a way of claiming the authenticity of products. A brief history of the Portland-based clothing manufacturing company Hirsch Weiss, later known as White Stag, illustrates how outdoor companies used this vision of the Western past to sell a new kind of leisure wear in the early 20th century. Max Hirsch was a German-Jewish immigrant. In 1907, he bought a company called the Willamette Tent and Awning Company. They had made mostly canvas goods for sailing, but he transformed it into first a workwear and then a leisure wear brand. His company was well known for one item in particular, and that was the Stag Cruiser, a popular wool jacket style of the 1920s. And the advertisements for this jacket, the Cruiser, illustrates how the narratives in advertising worked that showed the item crossing over from work into play. The role that the Cruiser played for timber cruisers of the woods of the Northwest was central to the advertising campaign. In the Pacific Northwest, there is a hardy group of outdoor men who demand the utmost in clothes, goes this advertising copy. Stags were originally designed for the exact use of these men. In Hirsch's explanation, the era of the timber cruiser had already passed, but he wanted consumers to embrace the mythology nonetheless. An ad from a 1925 booklet shows how that approach worked. This is a panel showing a man in a Stetson hat wearing a Stag Cruiser shifting gears on a tractor. The text below, if you can't read it, says, "Stags are built for outdoor work." This is an accurate explanation of the stag's origins, but as the panel that follows shows, stags were no longer intended for that audience. Instead, it was for people who were ready for work to be left behind and for leisure activities to take precedence. So the images show the man of leisure, carrying golf clubs, carrying ski poles, and also a pipe. The Cruiser was indeed once built for work, these images suggest, but now it was intended for play. And customers loved this jacket. They wrote into the company expressing their satisfaction not just with the goods, but also with the identity that it brought them. "I received my Stag in Hunter's bright red," wrote Harold Baumberger of Mannheim, Pennsylvania in 1929. "I am very well pleased with it, and I shall show my Stag to other members of my hunting club. I know they will be pleased with it too." This company promoted the brand by emphasizing not just its worker origins, but also its Western ones. Born in the West and ready for action announced one ad that features this image of the cowboy in the mountains. This brand created a regional outdoor-oriented style that built on the narrative that it was rugged Western workwear, even after that company left that market behind. Of course, in some ways, the Stag is just a jacket, but we can look to these prescriptive documents to understand how outdoor companies were selling ideas of the West and the wild as much as they were selling material objects. Outdoor experiences in the early 20th century were embedded in commercial interactions. Stores, catalogs, and companies became central to the outdoor experience, a sharp contrast to the suspicion of bought things from a generation earlier. Through catalogs, advertisements, and creative in-store environments, C.C. Filson, David T. Abercrombie, Eddie Bauer, Harold Hirsch, and many other outdoor company owners established their authority, trademarked their brands, and marketed their products. The link between the Blaze Trail and the Boulevard was firmly in place. It was to these men that the U.S. military turned to as a specter of extreme weather warfare loomed large beginning in 1939. The Quartermaster Corps, which is the branch of the U.S. military that's charged with producing uniforms and distributing them, wanted to create a military uniform for global war. So the military brought in outside consultants, people who had manufactured and distributed outdoor clothing and equipment, because they were the ones who were the most expert, they thought, on cold weather. Civilian consultants like Eddie Bauer brought their expertise sourcing down feathers or designing packports, and Eddie Bauer and his contemporaries in turn were influenced by the military and took those influences back to civilian life in the years that followed. In 1941 and 1942, the military sent mountaineers to Colorado, Washington, and Alaska to test equipment and clothing. They brought with them the best available from the consumer market, so this Ella Bean jacket style that you see here, as well as military uniforms, and they did some testing on them. Now, this initial field work was pretty cheap for the military to do, but it wasn't satisfactory to the Quartermaster Corps, because they wanted scientific results, not some subjective notion that outdoorsmen were giving them from the side of a mountain. So to equip an army of millions, the Quartermaster Corps developed a research and development laboratory There, they were going to create a program that would offer them scientific proof for the best lab-based approach to clothing the human body. The results of all this laboratory study, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A, was a newly designed uniform system. It was called the M1943 system after the year it was created. And this is an image of what that system looked like. If you look for the person who's most fully clothed on one side of the image, he's wearing the M43 jacket. But it's a system because it also includes the sweater, the long underwear, all the things underneath operate together because they're all single light layers that together will keep the soldier warm and dry. The notion of layering might not seem revolutionary to you, but it was radically new for the US military. It was outdoors people, outdoor manufacturers as well as mountaineers, who brought the notion of layering. Light single layers put together could keep someone more dry than a heavy wool overcoat to the US military. And the military in turn helped spread this idea to millions over the course of World War II. Many soldiers learned about layering because the military had indoctrination courses, including one in the South Pacific that educated more than 700,000 men about how to dress for extreme cold weather while they sat under the shade of palm trees. They also embedded the idea of layering into the very designs of the uniforms themselves. Both the clothing and the laboratory studies from the military quickly made their way to the civilian world. One of the ways that happened was through military surplus. That's a chapter just by itself. But additionally, outdoor company owners who worked for the military during the war brought those designs back to their manufacturing program. So for instance, Hirsch, the son of the original Hirsch who I was just talking about, was a consultant in DC for the Quartermaster Corps, and as early as 1943, he was bringing the design of this M1943 jacket back with him to Portland, and that's why you see here a catalog from White Stag, or Hirsch Weiss, that brand, that features something that looks very suspiciously like the M1943 field jacket. It has the same cinchable waist, the same big pillow pockets in the front, and a very loose fit. So it's almost identical. He highlights the military influence, in fact, in the advertising copy. The war's influence on Eddie Bauer was similarly broad. The company had been a regional hunting and fishing outfitter, but ended the war poised to be a national brand. Bauer came away with new sources of down and a new method for processing down feathers, which allowed him to expand insulated clothing production. He had a national reputation because he played a role in a campaign to have American hunters contribute their down feathers to the war effort. And the company was well situated to meet new demand because in a few short years, Eddie Bauer's production of packboards and sleeping bags had increased to hundreds of thousands per year. The influence of military testing during World War II is the one strand that I'll trace forward, though. At the start of the war, Eddie Bauer, L.L. Bean, and others thought that the best way to test their equipment, to know if it was ready for the consumer market, was to go on a hunting trip with the equipment and test it themselves. But the scientific approach to testing reshaped the outdoor world, just as layering had reshaped the military. Until World War II, most outdoors people had relied on natural fibers like wool or cotton, for instance. But when it really rained, they kept hoping for some miracle, a magical new material that might be able to keep them totally dry while still allowing their sweat to escape when they were working hard by moving physically up a mountain or something like that. In the 1970s or 1980s, chemical companies and consumers together built a new outdoor tradition that centered around high-tech nature. Outdoor experts gradually began to recommend these man-made synthetic fibers, or polymers of petrochemicals, created by scientists in laboratories to mimic or improve on natural fibers. These, they said, were the best choice for getting back to nature safely and comfortably. One example of that is the material Gore-Tex, an ad for which is represented behind me. Gore-Tex, a thin laminate produced by W.L. Gore & Associates, an American chemical manufacturer, is a synthetic derived from polytetrafluoroethylene, PTFE, which is the same chemical that makes up the non-stick pan coating called Teflon that you may have heard of. Though PTFE then and now continues to have mostly industrial and medical applications, Gore saw it had promise as that miracle material that outdoors people had been hoping for. And that was because it had microscopic pores, which would allow this sweat vapor to escape while keeping larger drops of water, so rain basically, out. Consumers, however, couldn't see Gore-Tex. It was a laminate, which means it's a very thin, flat material that would be bonded to one or two other fabrics, like nylon. Chemical companies wanted to make it recognizable. And so they, along with outdoor companies, employed a group of people called comfort scientists who worked together with marketers to get across the value and effectiveness of this invisible ingredient. This coffee break test is one example. The test would come with a little packet of coffee and a rubber band, and they said, make the coffee, turn it upside down, and you can see the sweat vapor is able to escape, but the liquid doesn't pour out. There's Gore-Tex at work. Another good example of that is this shower. In trade shows and at point of sale, Gore used these rain rooms as a dramatic way to prove the worth of their materials in the moment. And they're drawn almost exactly from the military laboratories of World War II. Another way this education happened was through hang tags. As thick as little booklets, you might have read one of these at an outdoor store sometime. They often include diagrams that explain how the material works, because of course it's not obvious and you can't even see it or feel it. They would include diagrams of moisture movement so consumers can understand that the material was working, and even what comfort itself should feel like. By the mid-1980s, an alphabet soup of trademark goods dominated outdoors people's packing lists, like DuPont's Holofill, Qualifill, Sontiq polyester fiberfill insulation, and 3M's Thinsulate insulation, and many more. Even with the short lifespan of plastic-derived materials, few consumers saw their embrace of a synthetic wilderness as a contradiction to the nature that they were trying to get back to. The ubiquitous shift in attitudes about synthetic materials is well illustrated by this one example I have. The Adirondack Museum and Library in New York has a museum exhibit dedicated to the history of outdoor recreation in the United States. There they have this mannequin, Apple Annie, because she has an apple in her hand, who was dressed for decades in the ubiquitous hiking outfit of the era. Jeans and an LL Bean plaid shirt. It was bright red. Some college students in the early 2000s came into this museum exhibit and they were shocked and actually quite concerned to see how she was dressed in cotton. Because they said, cotton kills, right? We don't want to represent outdoor recreation in this way because people need to know the right way to dress for the outdoors. That would be with modern synthetic fabric. So they made it a class assignment for the semester to redress Apple Annie in all synthetics. Eastern Mountain Sports donated the material, and they wrote a new label for her describing the clothing that she was wearing and why it was necessary not just for comfort but for safety. But the dominance of synthetic materials is not the end of the story, as you might guess. Despite the ubiquity of synthetics for high-tech equipment and everyday wear, the return in popularity of natural fibers by the end of the 20th century that continues today shows how some began to question just how miraculous these materials were. So I'll end here with the Patagonia advertisement from 2011. This ran in the New York Times, a full-page ad on America's shopping holiday, Black Friday. The company ran the ad, it said, to encourage readers to think about the role that they play and the company plays in consumerism. The notion of don't buy this jacket highlights that the company is aware of how it is encouraging people to keep buying new products, even if those products are somehow relatively sustainable. Contemporary listeners will recognize, concerned about the effects of consumption on a national and global scale, will recognize the lament that cultures of unrestrained buying and selling are a problem. What may surprise you all, however, is that both the culture of consumption and the lament about its stultifying effects on the American character date back more than a century. Indeed, we would not trace this critique back to the backpacking boom of the 1970s. We would not trace it back to the economic boom of the post-war period, or even the rise of mass consumer culture in the 1920s. As early as the 1880s, guidebooks and outdoors people decried the loss of craft skill and the characteristics of rugged manhood that went with it. Gadgets, they complained, did not just weigh too heavily on one's shoulders in a pack. Gadgets also represented the incursion of outsiders, beginners, and especially those who dared to buy their way into belonging. Despite this critique, however, buying itself became the carefully cultivated skill that many outdoors people sought. Though packing lists have changed radically in the last 100 years, the notion of the outdoor store as a jumping-off place, as a necessary and welcome gateway to the woods, remains. Indeed, for many Americans in the 21st century, the only way to get to the place they call nature is by gearing up first. For some outdoor enthusiasts, the contradictions of consumerism and nature, of buying this jacket, cannot be reconciled. But the scale and pace of this consumption threatens not just the cherished wilderness concept, but the real material world as well. The outdoor industry, firmly placed in history, in cities, and contemporary relationships of production and consumption, has never been exempt from these larger issues. Thank you.